South Africa's case against Israel for committing genocidal acts in Gaza will be heard in the International Court of Justice from Thursday. If the court rules in South Africa's favour, they'll order Israel to cease its hostilities against the Palestinian territories. But South Africa isn't just taking on Israel in the court. Plenty of countries in the West, not least of all the United States, have a vested interest in the outcome of the case, having supplied Israel with massive funds and many of the weapons being used against Palestinians in Gaza. If the court rules against Israel, the US and others will be implicated in supporting genocide. And that means in filing this case, South Africa is taking on massive global powers. This is a big deal, a really big deal. So why are they doing it? Well, it's because South Africa knows better than most about the nature of the apartheid practiced in Israel. In a recent episode of my podcast, Crash Course, I interviewed former South African ANC MP, so a colleague of Mandela, Andrew Feinstein. These were some connections he drew between Israel today and apartheid South Africa.
It shocked me the first time I was in the occupied territories that there are separate roads for Palestinians to use and for Israelis to use. There are separate number plates, so cars are easily identified. Now, South African apartheid was never quite as efficient as that. I do think that that sort of separateness, though, also had a similar social and cultural manifestation. You know, for instance, I was on a trip with South African human rights activists to Israel and then the occupied territories. I was in Tel Aviv, and one evening I was just walking along the beach and I started speaking to a group of young Israelis. And it was as though Palestine and Palestinians didn't exist. You know, someone looked shocked when I asked what contact they have with Palestinians. And they said, well, I don't have contact with Palestinians.
And when you make the connection between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid, often the response you get is, how offensive, how dare you compare Israel to South Africa? Actually, lots of people you speak to with knowledge of both say Israeli apartheid is even worse. Right? That's not to diminish the horror of South African apartheid. But if you think of the bombing raining down on the Palestinians in Gaza, if you think about sort of the systematic, as Andrew Feinstein was talking about there, different roads for Israeli citizens and Palestinians in the West Bank. He's saying this is more efficient than South African apartheid. There are many reasons to think that Israeli apartheid is even worse, right? But the link between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel goes much deeper than historical analogies. Leading Black South Africans have always seen their struggle for freedom and self-determination as the same as that of the Palestinians. After Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, but before he was elected president in 1994, he appeared on a US town hall broadcast. This is what he said about the Palestinian struggle.
As far as Yasser Arafat is concerned, I explained to Mr. Sidney that we identify with the PLO because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination. We have many Jews, members of the Jewish community in our struggle, and they have occupied very top positions. But that does not mean to say that the enemies of Israel are our enemies. We refuse to take that position. You can call it being political or a moral question, but for anybody who changes his principles depending on whom he is dealing, that is not a man who can lead a nation.
So Nelson Mandela there mentioning that many leading figures in the ASC were Jewish. Obviously, I forgot to mention that Andrew Feinstein is himself Jewish. Lots of people were part of that movement, South African Jews, against apartheid. It wasn't just that the ANC's struggle was aligned with the same struggle in Palestine, though. Black South Africans and Palestinians also had a common enemy, right? And that's because Israel supported South Africa's apartheid regime economically, politically, and militarily. Both apartheid South Africa and Israel came into existence in the same year, 1948. That's when the Afrikaner Nationalist Party gained control of South Africa and when Palestine was partitioned. Initially, Israel was critical of South Africa, taking part in international boycotts and sanctions. But that changed following the 1973 Yom Kippur War fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab nations. In its wake, almost all of Free Africa broke diplomatic ties with Tel Aviv. At the same time, white South Africans began to identify with Israel, finding common ground with a largely white colonial enclave, fighting off the displaced original inhabitants. In 1971, South African Prime Minister John Vorster, who oversaw the trial and imprisonment of Mandela, said this about Israel. "We view Israel's position and problems with understanding and sympathy. Like us, they have to deal with terrorist infiltration across the border. And like us, they have enemies bent on their destruction." Vorster had been interred as a Nazi sympathizer during the Second World War, but when he visited Israel in 1976, he was warmly welcomed. Vorster was invited to lay a wreath at the Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem. Now, that commemorates the 6 million Jews murdered by the Third Reich, a movement Vorster once supported. And Vorster went on to hold meetings with Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Defense Minister Shimon Peres. Peres would later become the country's Prime Minister. At a state dinner, Rabin toasted, quote, "the ideals shared by Israel and South Africa, the hopes for justice and peaceful coexistence." Throughout the 1970s, Israel abstained on UN resolutions against South African apartheid, and in 1975, Israel even offered to sell South Africa nuclear weapons. The Guardian reported this about a memo marked confidential and only uncovered in 2010. The top-secret minutes of the meeting recorded that, quote, "Minister Boffa expressed interest in a limited number of units of chalet, subject to the correct payload being available." The document then records, Minister Perez said the correct payload was available in 3 sizes. Minister Boffa expressed his appreciation and said that he would ask for advice. The 3 sizes are believed to refer to the conventional, chemical, and nuclear weapons. The use of a euphemism, the correct payload, reflects Israeli sensitivity over the nuclear issue and would not have been used had it been referring to conventional weapons. Chalet was a code name for Israel's Jericho missiles. They're capable of delivering a nuclear warhead. Israel denies the authenticity of the document. But it would fit a pattern. And it's been confirmed that South Africa sold large quantities of uranium to Israel for its own nuclear program, a program that Israel has, of course, always denied having, even though everyone knows they have it. And in pursuing these close links, Israel was out of step with the rest of the international community. In 1977, the United Nations imposed a mandatory arms embargo against South Africa. Israel ignored it and secretly continued to sell arms to South Africa, with the South African government's official yearbook containing this quote in 1978. "Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. They are both situated in a predominantly hostile world, inhabited by dark people." So the racism there, not hidden. By 1981, South Africa's military had over 200 Israeli advisors. South Africa's government instituted a state of emergency throughout the 1980s as ANC and other resistance forces gathered strength, and Israel's military support only grew. A 2013 Haaretz article reported this. Israel shared with South Africa its technologically advanced systems. Senior officials in the Defense Ministry and Israel Defense Forces had excellent ties with their South African counterparts, led by Defense Minister Magnus Malan, Military Chief of Staff Constant Viljoen, and head of the South African state defense industry. The largest deal was reportedly signed in the summer of 1988. Israel sold South Africa 60 Kafir combat planes that were no longer in use by the Israel Air Force. These were substantially upgraded and put to use by South Africa's Air Force and renamed the Atlas Cheetah. The deal was worth $1.7 billion, an unprecedented sum. But international pressure on South Africa to end apartheid soon spread to Israel too. In the late 80s, Israel was forced to stop selling arms to South Africa. That was after the United States threatened to cut off its support for Israel. But the movement for a free South Africa did not forget Israel's role in supporting apartheid. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years. 4 years later, he won South Africa's presidency in the first free and open elections in the country's history, but he refused to visit Israel until 1999, when he said this.
"I have come here in order to pay my respects to the government and the people of Israel. Many people have questioned why I should come here, because Israel work very closely with the apartheid regime. But I say to them, I have spoken and made peace with some of the men who slaughtered our people like animals. We worked with them and were able to bring about a peaceful transformation in our country. And I say Israel cooperated with apartheid, but they did not get involved in the atrocities of the apartheid regime.
The new South African government has maintained relations with Israel, but at times they've been distinctly frosty. In May 2018, South Africa withdrew its ambassador from Israel over the killing of more than 200 Palestinians by the IDF during the Great March of Return. But some Afrikaner, white South Africans, perhaps unhappy with South Africa's new freedoms, retain an affection for Israel. In 2021, Haaretz reported this. Some Afrikaners who tend to be strict Protestants have been converting to Judaism and moving to Israel, and especially to West Bank settlements. The article reports this. Among the first Afrikaner converts to make Aliyah were the Taljaards from Randfontein, a gold mining city near Johannesburg. They came in the mid-1990s and began raising sheep in the settlement of Susia, where they were often involved in violent clashes with Palestinians from nearby villages in the South Hebron Hills. Jacob, the eldest of 14 children in the family, was killed in a tractor accident several years ago. He once famously told an Israeli television reporter that he loved the apartheid system and thought it was the best thing in the world. Now, we've come across another Taljaard, the name of the family in that Haaretz quote. He is currently fighting in the IDF. Leroy Taljaard, who is clearly South African, posted this on Instagram in November.
Israel is an apartheid state. Just read this post that said that South Africa is about to pull out all of its diplomats out of Israel. And the caption of the post reads, South Africans know what an apartheid looks like. Now, we forget to mention some things when we say these things, such as there are 2 million Arab Israelis living in Israel, which are allowed to be Muslim, Christian, any religion they want. There are about 200,000 Ethiopian Jews living in Israel that can practice any religion they want. These people, whether they be Arab, European, African, can become politicians, can become teachers, can become doctors. They can become the president of the country if they should choose to do so. If we're going to go according to this narrative, any country willing to defend its people and its borders is an apartheid state.
Not every country is illegally occupying territory which isn't part of itself, right? So this idea every country would defend its borders. Well, Israel has illegally occupied the West Bank. I mean, some people would say for 75 years, other people would say for 56 years. Everyone should be able to agree that for 56 years they have been occupying the West Bank. So since the 1967 war. So this idea, they're just protecting their borders. No, Israel chose not to have normal borders because they wanted to expand their settlements and expand their territory. There is bad luck for Leroy. Not only does he not seem to be the expert on human rights he thinks he is, but he could be in trouble if he wants to return to South Africa because the country is planning to prosecute any of its citizens serving in the IDF. It says that South African citizens serving in the IDF may be, quote, contributing to the violation of international law and the commission of further international crimes. And it's exactly those international crimes that South Africa is charging Israel with in The Hague. So it's no accident that it's South Africa who were the first country to hold Israel to account for its genocidal acts in Gaza. I'm joined now by Dalia Gabriel. Welcome onto Novara Live this evening. Can I get your thoughts on the history of South Africa and Israel and sort of the symbolism of it being South Africa who tomorrow will be taking Israel to the International Court of Justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that you've outlined the comparison between South African and Israeli apartheid is pretty comprehensive. And, we talk about how there is this immense shared investment in the ability to successfully execute a racial logic, demarcation of geography, the fact that, miscegenation is illegal in Israel. Like, that doesn't exist unless you are trying to create a separation, a racial separation in your country. And in many ways, there are obviously clear parallels between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid. I would say that actually the difference is that there is something very specific about the Israeli project that is much more akin actually to US settler colonialism, whereby the end goal is actually that kind of genocidal, ethnic cleansing, removal of what they consider to be the insubordinate population. When you look at apartheid South Africa, the Afrikaner settlers were not as invested in the actual elimination of Black people, of Black South Africans. They actually required Black South Africans to continue to exist in the country because the Black South Africans were the foundation of the economy. They were the people doing all the work. They were the people who were actually making the country run. What they wanted was total and utter subjugation in every form of life. Whereas with Israel, the project is more gearing towards, particularly of Palestinians in Gaza, of that elimination, genocidal bent. Because yes, sure, Palestinians in Gaza are used as cheap labor by Israel. But if the actual dream of, Israel having an ethno-state from the river to the sea could be realized with the removal of the Palestinians, they would happily ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in Gaza and just replace that cheap labor force with labor from Asia, which is what they already do. And so that particular bent towards a genocidal project of elimination, I think is actually an undercurrent within the Israeli project here that isn't as comparable in the South African project. When it comes to, the legal claim, look, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend that I know how tomorrow is going to go or what the implications are going to be. It does seem to me, though, that from the research that I've done, that the reason that the South Africans have such a good case, such a strong case, and a case that is a cause for concern, not only for Israel, but for Israel's allies, the US, Britain, because if it is found that there is plausibility of genocide, because the actual ruling to say whether or not genocide has happened will take many years to actually come to fruition, but what can happen in the meantime is a sort of motion for plausibility, then that implicates all the people that have facilitated with weapons, with money, with political cover, and even with personnel, the fact that implicates all those people as well as the Israeli state. So the reason that the South African state has such a strong case is because they have so much ample evidence for the thing that is typically very difficult to prove when it comes to legislating that something is a genocide, which is intent. They don't just have, the scale of violence, the scale of death, the scale of destruction, but they have statements, literal public statements from Israeli ministers, people in the government who have essentially said that the objective of this war is to remove the Palestinians from Gaza. Sometimes they talk about this as, we need to make life so inhospitable in Gaza. We need to evacuate people from Gaza, have Smotrich sort of saying it incredibly explicitly that we need to evacuate Palestinians from Gaza. And then you have people like Netanyahu who maybe can't go quite that far, but will use it in euphemisms, saying things like, the voluntary migration of Palestinians from out to leave Gaza. So the fact that we have so much of these statements from Israeli officials that seem to underscore intent is why the South African case is so strong. And it just speaks to the level of impunity that Israel has enjoyed, that they have arguably accidentally created mountains and mountains of incriminating evidence against them, because in their mind the US was giving them the green light to go as they please. And as far as they were concerned, the US was the world. But what they've realized now is that the US is not the world. There are actually other entities that also have, as much as the US has tried to muffle these processes or defang these processes from actually being able to happen, or weaponize, things like aid and all of these things in order to stop these kind of legal processes from being being instigated, there are actually other countries and other states with different histories and different relationships to empire and apartheid and racism that will be having a different perspective. And it is, of course, a deeply poetic justice that it is South Africa who have a living memory of defeating apartheid in the lifetime of people who currently are still alive, that they are the ones that will be standing up to the genocide that we are seeing today. And, this is, of course, incredibly important because not only for, first and foremost for the Palestinians who stopping this onslaught against them and stopping the fact that there is essentially a project to eliminate them as Palestinians living in Palestine. That being curbed is the utmost priority. But also for all of us, if this project of ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians being done in such an overt and public and well-documented way, if this is successful with no political or legal blowback, then none of us in this world are safe. None of us in this world are free. So first and foremost, this is really important for the Palestinians' survival, but it is also important for all of our survival because the outcome of this is going to be the blueprint for the world for the post-October 2023 world.
We will, of course, be talking about this case more tomorrow and Friday. For now, though, as you know, it will be heard tomorrow in The Hague. 11 other countries support South Africa's case, including Malaysia, Turkey, and Pakistan. Britain's Jeremy Corbyn will also be amongst the delegation, appearing in the International Court of Justice, and leading the South African Council is John Dugard. He's former UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, so he will presumably be very knowledgeable on this issue. Also supporting the case is Israeli MP Ofer Kasif, who colleagues tried to have ejected from the Knesset. So his colleagues tried to have him ejected from the Knesset, and that's Israel's parliament, of course. As a result, he told Owen Jones why he supports the case.
It seems that some crimes are or have been done there. And so that should be investigated. And my signature is to investigate. Israel, as part of the Convention Against Genocide, is not above the law. It's not above the international law. And in that sense, the government should be investigated. And this petition, by the way, and I will, if I have the time, I'll elaborate on that later. The petition, in my view, is not anti-Israeli. It's not against Israel. It is against the government of Israel. But because the government of Israel is the enemy of Israel, it is eventually for the interest of Israelis as well to sign this petition.
Very brave man, very rare among Israeli MPs to be supporting something like this.